all wave our arms. All right. Got that restorative motion going there. I wanted to, just in preface of what I'm going to say, when I worked for Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers from 1985 to 1990, I had the opportunity to travel to Africa, and primarily East Africa, and to war zones there, particularly Eritrea and Chad, and also into Mozambique. And I have also the privilege of having done organizing with Maryknoll Fathers of a speaking tour in the United States around war in Africa and apartheid that took us into particularly the South, into congressional districts that were key in support of apartheid. And it was remarkable how much in common did the visitors from Africa who were speakers and black Americans in the United States have in common with respect to the violence that they had experienced, with respect to the confiscation of their lands, and with the continuing presence, and in some cases overwhelming presence, of white institutions that were taking away their power. Now, bringing it up to today, I've been very, very curious as a person trying to do organizing around drone warfare about the difficulty in engaging people more broadly and engaging people within the anti-war community in the drone issue. There's one form of U.S. foreign policy that's actively killing people today. It has to do with drones, and then with what's called targeted killing commandos going secretly into places and killing people, as in the Phoenix program in Vietnam. And it has to do with our Air Force in an expanding war against people in the Middle East. And I want to recommend to you this book by Phyllis Bennett called Understanding ISIS, because it goes and gives a very good primer into issues and how to respond to issues when people say here they're afraid of ISIS. But the thing I want to look more deeply at is us as animals and how we make decisions about what we're going to act on and what we're going to pass on. And I think that there's a filtering mechanism within all of us that makes an instant decision moment by moment about what's threatening to us and what is okay to let go by. We're doing that, our brains are doing that now. If a bomb goes off, an explosion, a thunderstorm, part of our mind is going to that and deciding what we need to do to protect ourselves. Now, for African American people in this country, their filtering mechanism has to do with the observation of white behavior toward them at any given moment, and certainly particularly the behavior of police at any given moment. In the Horn of Africa, or in Afghanistan or Pakistan, the filtering mechanism for the people there in many, many places has to do with whether they hear the sound in the air of a drone, or whether they see other evidences of the United States military. Now, I want to trace this back into something that I think we all have grown up with, and our filtering mechanism is, I say our, and most of the people in this room, the filtering mechanism has to do with white supremacy. In other words, we come into a world where we find, and I grew up finding, that white people were essentially in control. Furthermore, it was a world, and when I go to church, I would find a white Jesus. And I would find that the notion of me being born into a supreme group of people, all powerful, unchallengeable, inevitably going forward with our own interests being taken care of, was part of my upbringing. And so if someone would say to me something about slavery, I might feel empathetic with that. If somebody said about voting rights, I might feel I could support that. But I wouldn't necessarily feel I had to get out in the street over that every single day or get arrested over it. So what we have at the moment, I believe, is a very serious remnant of slavery-born white supremacy that is preventing many of us from acting on these very deadly existential challenges for people of color overseas, and particularly in our own country for black people. This violence that has been done as part of slavery, the killing, underwrites the power of the economy and the white society. And I want to just reference a couple of studies that are very, very interesting. One comes out of Berkeley from maybe one of your colleagues, a woman named Caitlin Rosenthal. Now, she's a historian of U.S. business. I'm sorry, and she decided that she would study the accounting methods of business. And what she discovered was that the accounting methods on slave plantations was far in advance of the accounting methods in industrial business at that time. People were evaluated in a very careful way. When I say people, I mean slaves were evaluated in a very, very careful way. And she says, and she looked at, how this affects what we're doing now. And essentially what she's saying is that the methods of business decision about when was the slave most productive, what kind of punishment led to the greatest productivity, when was the slave to be retired from work, those judgments about human value inform corporate enterprise from that time going forward. And so she says, I'm interested in how corporate reports separate people from their workers. I look at the distance constructed by numbers and how much easier it is to justify all kinds of things when you don't have to go on the shop floor, you don't have to encounter people in person, and you only encounter them as these quantified units of productivity. Now, when you apply this more broadly to corporate behavior in the United States and corporate ambition, the absolute best is to have people who work for zero, and then you have to work backward and say, what's the minimum I can give to these people so that they can stay alive and clothe themselves? And that's where we're talking about the minimum wage here. We're not really talking about a living, growing, creative thing. We're talking about a notion that was born in slavery, whenever that started, but particularly we're talking about in the United States 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago, that still infect and inform corporate decisions that are not only based on that notion of market, but also on the willingness to kill to enforce the rules that they must have, in their view, to survive. So when we look at what's going on in terms of white supremacy, we see that that's very integrated into the whole concept of corporate advancement and the corporate structure throughout the world. It's been adopted by many different countries, not just the United States. So the next step that I wanted to talk about was where that takes us in history and in our own country's appraisal of what can be done in the world to advance the United States. And I wanted to go back to someone I learned about when I was in Africa, a man named Cecil Rhodes. Rhodesia was named for him. And Cecil Rhodes was actually, if you want to say, a product of slavery. He learned his lessons at the knees of slavery. He was born in 1853 when slavery had also already been going, in the United States for several hundred years. And he says, I contend that we are the first race in the world. That the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If there be a God, I think he would what he would like me to do is to paint as much of the Africa with the British red as possible. Now, does that sound at all like what the United States thinks about the rest of the world in terms of the common person in this country? Or we have to look inside of ourselves and ask, I don't like that, but can I live with that as white people? Can I live with that? Now, another thing that Cecil Rhodes said that's very, very interesting that I'll bring right up to the moment with our president. He says, to save 40 million inhabitants of the United Kingdom from a bloody civil war, our colonial statesmen must acquire new lands for settling and the surplus of the country and to provide new markets. The empire, as I have always said, is a bread and butter issue. So what we have is a Democratic Party that sees an analysis very similar to this, where we can accept going overseas, capturing oil, capturing resources, so that we can have a life of, how should we say, relative comfort for people and not set off a civil war. What's happened, though, is in the last several years that we've seen the United States is losing power over oil, losing power over these resources, and is creating stresses within this country, particularly because businesses do not feel a loyalty to the people of this country. They feel a loyalty to the slave analysis of going where the labor is the cheapest.
Good point. Amen.
So now we find ourselves in a situation where, through desperation and bad habits, we're still asserting our rights to capture resources in other places. In September 2013, Barack Obama stood in front of the United Nations and said, so let me take this opportunity to outline what has been U.S. policy toward the Middle East and North Africa, and what will be my policy during the remainder of my presidency. The United States of America is prepared to use all elements of our power, including military force, to secure our core interests in that region. Now that sounds very much to me like Cecil Rhodes.
Here it is.
And we find ourselves in a very deep problem of how do we, as white people, because that's what the majority of us are in this room, take a stand against white supremacy. Later on I can talk more about what white supremacy is, in my opinion, as distinct from racism, because I think they're two very different things. And I think white supremacy is an uncomfortable notion. Racism has become something, well, yeah, that's okay. You know, we can talk about racism. But we have a hard time talking about white supremacy. So in the coming, moments, minutes, hours of our conference, I would like for us to be thinking about some of these things, because we need to discuss what can we best do in this situation to stop the killing and to make total and 100% unity with our black sisters and brothers and with people of color in different parts of the world. Thank you.